November 5th, 1954, 2:17 a.m. A woman named Florence Kotz woke to the sound of her kitchen door being destroyed. Not knocked on, not rattled, destroyed. The sound of wood splintering cut through the silence of Waring Avenue like a gunshot. Florence sat up in bed, her heart hammering against her ribs. She lived alone in a modest ground-floor apartment in West Hollywood. Quiet neighborhood. Good people. Nothing bad ever happened here. The crash came again, louder. The unmistakable sound of an axe meeting wood. Someone was breaking into her home. Before she could scream, her bedroom door flew open. A blinding flashlight beam hit her face, pinning her to the bed like an insect under a microscope. Behind the light, shadows moved. Men. Multiple men. Their silhouettes filled her doorway. The flashlight moved closer. Heavy breathing, the shuffle of expensive shoes on her bedroom floor. She finally found her voice and screamed. The scream echoed through the building, out into the quiet street where a 1954 Cadillac sat idling with its lights off. But the men didn't leave. They stepped into her bedroom, the flashlight still trained on her terrified face. And for 3 seconds that felt like eternity, nobody moved. Then one of the men spoke. Jesus Christ. His voice carried shock, confusion, and the dawning realization of a catastrophic mistake. The flashlight lowered slightly, and in the spill of light, Florence saw 2 men in expensive suits, their faces registering horror and disbelief. One wore a fedora, the other had the athletic build of a former professional athlete. But Florence Kotz didn't recognize them. She was a 39-year-old secretary who lived a quiet life. She didn't read gossip magazines. She didn't follow Hollywood. She had no idea that the 2 men staring at her in shock were Frank Sinatra and Joe DiMaggio, 2 of the most famous men in America. And they had absolutely no idea who she was, because they had broken into the wrong apartment. To understand how 2 of the biggest stars in America ended up destroying a stranger's door in the middle of the night, you need to understand what brought them to Waring Avenue. You need to understand the obsession that drove Joe DiMaggio, the loyalty that made Frank Sinatra help his friend commit one of the most embarrassing mistakes in Hollywood history. But most importantly, you need to understand Marilyn Monroe. 9 days earlier, on October 27, 1954, Marilyn Monroe's divorce from Joe DiMaggio had become final. The marriage had lasted exactly 274 days, not even a full year. From the outside, it looked perfect. America's baseball hero married to the world's biggest sex symbol. The reality was a nightmare. DiMaggio had pursued Marilyn with single-minded intensity. When they met in 1952, he was captivated not by Marilyn the movie star, but by Norma Jean, the vulnerable woman beneath the platinum hair. He courted her aggressively. Flowers every day, phone calls that lasted hours. He promised her normalcy, stability, the kind of life she'd never had growing up in foster homes. Marilyn said yes, not because she loved him the way he loved her, but because she was tired. Tired of being touched by men she didn't want. Tired of studio executives treating her like property. Joe offered an escape, but marriage didn't fix anything. It made everything worse. DiMaggio wanted a wife who would stay home and give up Hollywood. Marilyn was at the peak of her career, working on films that would define her legacy. The clash was immediate and brutal. The breaking point came in September 1954 during the filming of The 7-Year Itch in New York City. The subway scene. Thousands of people watched as Marilyn stood over a subway grate in a white dress, the wind billowing the skirt up around her waist. Joe DiMaggio stood in the crowd and watched his wife being objectified by thousands of strangers. His jaw clenched tighter with each take, his hands balled into fists. When the filming wrapped, he grabbed Marilyn's arm and dragged her back to their hotel. What happened in that hotel room, nobody knows for certain, but staff reported hearing shouting, crashing furniture, a woman crying. The next morning, Marilyn had bruises on her arm. The marriage was over. But for Joe DiMaggio, it wasn't over. Not even close. The obsession that had driven him to pursue Marilyn now drove him to possess her. If he couldn't have her, he would know everything about her. Every move, every meeting, every man. He hired a private investigator named Barney Ruditsky. Ruditsky ran a detective agency that specialized in divorce cases and marital surveillance. He was expensive, discreet, and effective. DiMaggio gave him one job: follow Marilyn Monroe. Watch who she sees. where she goes, who she's sleeping with. For 2 weeks, Ruditsky and his team followed Marilyn throughout Los Angeles, and they discovered that Marilyn had been visiting a small apartment building at the corner of Waring Avenue and Kilka Drive. Regularly, always in the evening, always staying for several hours. Ruditsky knew who lived in that building, a woman named Sheila Stewart, a friend of Marilyn's. But more importantly, Sheila's vocal coach was Hal Schaefer, the same man who worked with Marilyn, the same man DiMaggio suspected was sleeping with his ex-wife. On the evening of November 5, 1954, Joe DiMaggio was having dinner with Frank Sinatra at Villa Capri, an Italian restaurant in Hollywood. The two men had been friends for years, bonded by their Italian heritage, their success, and their shared experience of loving women who were too much for them. Sinatra was going through his own heartbreak. Ava Gardner had recently walked out on him. Again. But this time felt different. This time, Ava had stayed gone. So Frank and Joe sat at Villa Capri, drowning their sorrows in wine and whiskey, two heartbroken men commiserating about the women who had destroyed them. That's when Barney Ruditsky called. The restaurant manager brought a phone to DiMaggio's table. Joe listened for 30 seconds, his face hardening with each word. When he hung up, he turned to Sinatra with fire in his eyes. "She's there. Right now. Marilyn's at that apartment on Waring with Schaefer." Frank saw the rage building in his friend, the humiliation, the betrayal. "We should go," Joe said. His voice was flat, emotionless, dangerous. "Go where?" Frank asked, though he already knew the answer. "To catch her, to get proof. Ruditsky's guys are already there with cameras. If we go now, we can catch them together. Get photographs. Show everyone what kind of woman she really is." It was a terrible idea. Frank Sinatra knew it was a terrible idea. He was a public figure. Getting involved in Joe's domestic drama could destroy them both. The scandal would be enormous. But Frank Sinatra had never been good at making smart decisions when emotions were involved. And Joe DiMaggio was his friend, his brother. "All right," Frank said, "let's go." They left Villa Capri in Joe's Cadillac. Frank brought along two of his associates. Their wives came too, for reasons nobody would ever adequately explain. Maybe they thought it was exciting. Maybe they were drunk. Maybe they just wanted to see Marilyn Monroe get caught cheating. They drove to the corner of Waring and Kilkea, where Ruditsky and his team were waiting. The private investigator had spotted Marilyn's white Cadillac convertible parked on the street. She was inside the building. Definitely inside. But there was a problem. The building had 3 apartments. 2 faced Waring Avenue, 1 faced Kilkea Drive. Ruditsky wasn't certain which apartment Marilyn had entered. DiMaggio didn't care. He knew Sheila Stewart lived in one of the upstairs units. That's where Marilyn would be. "Which door?" Frank asked. Ruditsky hesitated. He wasn't certain, but DiMaggio was paying him. DiMaggio was angry, and Ruditsky made his best guess. The ground floor, the one facing Waring. It was the wrong guess. They gathered at the back of the building, a group of 7 or 8 people moving through the dark like some kind of noir film gang. DiMaggio led the way. Frank followed close behind. One of Ruditsky's men carried a camera with a large spotlight flash attachment. The door was locked. Obviously, it was 2 a.m. DiMaggio didn't knock. He didn't call out. He kicked. The door held. He kicked again. Wood began to splinter around the lock. On the 3rd kick, the frame gave way and the door crashed inward. They poured through the kitchen, through the dark living room, flashlight beams cutting through the darkness, feet stumbling over unfamiliar furniture. Someone knocked over a lamp. Someone else cursed. They found the bedroom. DiMaggio threw open the door. The flashlight beam hit the bed, and there, sitting up in terror, clutching her sheets to her chest, was a woman none of them had ever seen before. Florence Kotz screamed, a real scream. Not the theatrical scream of a movie actress, but the raw, primal scream of a woman who believes she's about to be murdered in her own bed. The flashlight stayed on her face, blinding her. She couldn't see the men, but she could hear them. Heavy breathing, confused whispers, someone taking photographs, the flash going off in rapid succession. "Oh my God," someone said. "That's not her. Where is she?" DiMaggio's voice harsh with rage and confusion. "Where's Marilyn?" "I don't know what you're talking about," Florence screamed. "Get out! Get out of my house!" For a moment, nobody moved. The group stood frozen in a stranger's bedroom, the catastrophic nature of their mistake slowly dawning on them. They had broken into the wrong apartment, destroyed a door, terrified an innocent woman, all while trying to catch Marilyn Monroe, who wasn't even there. Frank Sinatra was the first to react. According to witnesses who came forward years later, Frank did something that perfectly captured his personality. He started laughing, not a nervous laugh, a full, genuine laugh. The absurdity of the situation hit him all at once. Here they were, breaking into apartments like common criminals, and they'd gotten the wrong place. The landlady, Virginia Blaskin, had been awakened by the commotion. She looked out her window and saw Joe DiMaggio looking furious. And she saw Frank Sinatra jumping up and down, smiling, looking up at her window like he was having the time of his life. The group fled. They ran back through the apartment, through the destroyed kitchen door, out into the night. They piled into cars and drove away, leaving Florence Kotz trembling in her bed, trying to explain to the police dispatcher what had just happened. Marilyn Monroe had never been in that building. She'd been upstairs at Sheila Stewart's apartment, exactly one floor above where the raid occurred. She heard the commotion, the shouting, the door breaking, Florence's screams. She knew immediately what had happened. Joe had come for her, and somehow, miraculously, they'd gotten the wrong apartment. Marilyn left through a back entrance and disappeared into the night, her white Cadillac still parked on Waring Avenue, serving as bait while she escaped. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Police arrived and found Florence's door destroyed, her apartment ransacked. She gave descriptions of the men. Dark suits, one wearing a fedora, flashlights, a camera. But she didn't know who they were. In the darkness and terror, she'd only registered shapes and voices. The police investigated, but found no fingerprints. No identification. Nothing that would lead them to the perpetrators. For 11 months, the story stayed buried. DiMaggio paid to have Florence's door repaired. Sinatra's lawyers offered compensation. Florence took the money, $7,500, and tried to forget the night she'd woken to find strangers in her bedroom. But in Hollywood, secrets never stay buried forever. In September 1955, a magazine hit newsstands that would change everything. Confidential Magazine, the most notorious gossip publication in America. They specialized in destroying celebrities, exposing affairs, revealing scandals, ending careers. Their September issue featured Marilyn Monroe on the cover. The headline promised to reveal the real reason for her divorce from Joe DiMaggio. Inside was the story of the wrong door raid. Every humiliating detail, the broken door, the wrong apartment, the terrified secretary, Frank Sinatra jumping up and down in the courtyard, Joe DiMaggio's obsessive surveillance. The story exploded across America. Newspapers picked it up. Radio shows discussed it. Comedians made jokes. The wrong door raid became shorthand for celebrity arrogance and stupidity. Joe DiMaggio was humiliated beyond comprehension. The story made him look pathetic. A jealous ex-husband so desperate to catch his former wife that he'd resorted to hiring investigators and breaking down doors. The great Yankee Clipper reduced to a stalker in expensive shoes. But the worst part was that Frank Sinatra had been there. Frank, who was supposed to be his friend, had participated in this disaster. And according to the Confidential article, Frank had laughed, had smiled, had treated the whole thing like a joke. DiMaggio stopped speaking to Sinatra. Completely. No phone calls, no dinners at Villa Capri, no friendly meetings. Their friendship died in that apartment on Waring Avenue. Frank tried to reach out. He called. He sent messages. He tried to explain that he'd only been there to support Joe, that he hadn't meant to laugh. Joe didn't care. As far as Joe DiMaggio was concerned, Frank Sinatra had betrayed him. But betrayal was complicated, because while Joe was ending his relationship with Frank, something else was beginning. Frank and Marilyn. In the early 1960s, after Marilyn's marriage to Arthur Miller fell apart, she and Frank Sinatra began an affair. It was never official, never public, but everyone in Hollywood knew. Joe DiMaggio heard about it. Everyone told him, his ex-wife and his former best friend, the two people who had been there that night on Waring Avenue, now together. The affair didn't last long. Marilyn was too damaged by then, too dependent on pills and alcohol. Frank wanted to help her, but he didn't know how. Nobody did. On August 5th, 1962, Marilyn Monroe was found dead in her home in Brentwood. Barbiturate overdose. The official cause of death was ruled probable suicide. Joe DiMaggio took control of the funeral arrangements. He planned everything meticulously, determined to give Marilyn the dignity in death that she'd been denied in life. Small service, no press, no Hollywood people, and absolutely no Frank Sinatra. Joe issued a specific order. Frank Sinatra was not welcome. Frank didn't fight it. He stayed away. He sent flowers anonymously. He played Marilyn's favorite songs alone in his recording studio, crying while he sang. But he didn't attend her funeral. For the rest of his life, Joe DiMaggio blamed himself for Marilyn's death. If he'd been less controlling, less jealous, if he'd loved her differently. He sent roses to her grave 3 times a week for 20 years. Red roses. Always red roses. He never remarried. When people asked why, he'd say simply, "I had my chance at love. I destroyed it." Frank Sinatra never spoke publicly about the Wrong Door raid. When reporters brought it up, he'd deflect or walk away. But people close to him said the incident haunted him, not because of the public embarrassment, but because of what it cost him, his friendship with Joe, his relationship with Marilyn. In 1993, biographer Kitty Kelly asked Frank about that night. He was 77 years old by then, his voice still strong, but his body failing. He thought about the question for a long time before answering. "Joe was my friend," Frank finally said. "He was hurting. I thought I was helping him. I didn't know I was helping him destroy himself." Florence Kotz lived quietly for the rest of her life. She married and became Florence Ross. The $7,500 settlement paid for a down payment on a house in the valley. She rarely talked about that night, though occasionally friends would ask. "Were you scared?" they'd ask. "Terrified," she'd admit. "But looking back, I was lucky. They were looking for Marilyn Monroe. If they'd found who they were actually looking for, it might have been much worse." The Wrong Door raid entered Hollywood folklore, a cautionary tale about jealousy, obsession, and how quickly pride turns to humiliation. But beneath the humor was something darker. Men who believed they owned women, possession masquerading as love, driving them to break down doors and terrify strangers, friendship destroyed by jealousy, fame protecting no one from stupidity. Joe DiMaggio died in 1999 at the age of 84. Frank Sinatra had died the year before. Neither man ever publicly reconciled. The friendship that had survived so much died on Waring Avenue in 1954, murdered by a wrong door and a terrified woman's scream. In the end, the Wrong Door raid destroyed more than Florence Kotz's kitchen door. It destroyed friendships, exposed obsessions, and revealed the hollow desperation behind Hollywood's glamorous facade. 2 of the most famous men in the world, reduced to criminals fleeing from their own mistake. And somewhere in heaven or hell or wherever dead movie stars go, Marilyn Monroe probably laughed about it. The men who claimed to love her, who wanted to possess her, who tried to catch her in the act of being human, had kicked down the wrong door and found nothing but their own stupidity staring back at them. That's the real story, not the gossip magazine version, not the sanitized Hollywood legend. The real story of 3 people who all lost that night, and 1 innocent woman who just wanted to sleep peacefully in her own bed.